International news now.
Okay, so we want to begin this next part of the lecture with just a brief overview of the United Nations. President Trump was addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations last week, or the main deliberative body of the United Nations. The UN is an international organization founded in 1945 after World War II to promote peace, security, and cooperation among nations. It currently comprises 193 member states. These membership rules means that it includes most states in the international system. So this principle of universal membership enhances its legitimacy as an organizational body that can claim as being representative of global public opinion. The General Assembly is one of the principal organs of the UN and serves as its main deliberative body. Each member state has one vote, regardless of their size or power. The General Assembly meets annually in September at UN headquarters in New York, where giving world leaders a chance to gather and discuss pressing global issues. Thus, President Trump addressed the UN last week as part of this institutionalized process, whereby the UN hosts world leaders for annual meetings. Now, the UN influences global politics in many ways. First, it provides an institutional forum for meetings of world leaders. This institutional forum includes rules for who has a seat at the table and how decisions get made. Note that we didn't have Elon Musk or Bill Gates addressing the UN. Instead, it's state leaders, national leaders like President Trump. Now, we can think about universal membership as one such rule structuring deliberations at the UN. It makes the process more unwieldy and sometimes ineffective by hindering the search for consensus, because everyone has a chance to talk if they want it. And so President Trump criticized the UN last week for too much talk and not enough action. However, this principle of universal membership simultaneously enhances the legitimacy of the organization by giving most states the right to participate in its collective decision-making process. Second, this institutional forum provides information to world leaders about the preferences and expected actions of each other. Accordingly, it shapes expectations about what others will do and facilitates negotiations then on the basis of those publicly disclosed interests. For example, it's hard to negotiate without knowing what others want because you don't know what kind of concessions you need to make to get a deal. President Trump was very clear about U.S. national interests last week. Third, the UN provides administrative resources to address global externalities associated with transnational issues that can't be addressed by any one country. And so we can think of prominent examples like those associated with climate change, public health, the pandemic associated with COVID, and refugee flows as people move from one country to another to escape war zones. The UN, for example, convenes climate change researchers for discovery and measurement. It organizes and coordinates the scientific community to explore the risks and estimate the damages associated with climate change. We can think about the UN as sponsoring the convening of public health experts to, again, identify when pandemics will occur, to coordinate investments in research associated with containing disease outbreaks. And President Trump is going to talk about this, and he talked about this in his speech, and we're going to see, and we'll discuss this a little bit in the second part of the lecture. The UN also provides financial resources to refugees to try and mitigate the economic costs associated with their displacement and movement to other countries. Fourth, we need to recognize when we're talking about the UN that it has limited enforcement capacity. It's hard to do that because it has universal membership. And so if the UN is in the business repeatedly of enforcing its decisions, that means that it is at risk of compromising the sovereignty of its members. As a result, the UN provides an institutional forum to facilitate collective action on the part of states, but it generally has to rely on consensus and support from its members to execute the collective will of the larger body politic in the world, right? In part because the UN is designed to protect and respect the principles associated with sovereignty for its member states. So the UN, if it can't enforce its resolutions without violating the sovereignty of member states, it's oftentimes, and this is what Trump is going to talk about, is viewed as ineffective on the part of world leaders. Right? Again, Trump criticized the UN last week for engaging in too much talk and not enough action. So with that in mind, we're now going to watch an overview video from PBS last week describing the diplomatic activity around Trump's UN speech. So let's go ahead and run the first clip.
As Nick Schifrin reports, the president's speech focused less on U.S. leadership and more on what he believes the rest of the world is getting wrong.
Today, to an international community that doubts but still desires U.S. leadership, President Trump delivered a dark disparagement of global priorities.
I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell.
With that broadside, President Trump took his closed border vision global. And U.S. officials tell PBS NewsHour the U.S. will push to change 75-year-old international refugee laws. Asylum seekers would have to claim protection in the first country they entered. Asylum would be temporary, and the host country would arbitrate the asylum case.
We have to solve the problem, and we have to solve it in their countries, not create new problems in our countries.
And President Trump combined that criticism with a denigration of decades of efforts to combat what the scientific community judges an existential threat to the planet.
This climate change, it's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. I love the people of Europe, and I hate to see it being devastated by energy and immigration. This double-tailed monster destroys everything in its wake, and they cannot let that happen any longer.
But much of Europe is more focused on war in Ukraine, and today President Trump announced a major policy shift. He wrote on Truth Social, "I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. The original borders from where this war started is very much an option." Russia's also been escalating inside of NATO. Last week, 3 Russian jets flew within 10 miles of the Estonian parliament. And the week before that, an unprecedented number of Russian drones flew deep into Poland, whose Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, vowed not to let it happen again.
We are ready for any decision aimed at destroying objects that might pose a threat to us. For example, Russian fighter jets, if they violate, for example, fly over our territory. But I also need to be absolutely certain, and I won't elaborate on this point, that all allies will treat this in exactly the same way as we do.
Today, President Trump agreed.
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do. It's pretty clear. Okay, let me highlight a few things from this clip. First, we see that President Trump's critique of 2 sets of global policies, what he describes as the two-headed monster of migration and climate change. Now, this is a very public declaration of U.S. interests, simultaneously telling world leaders that the United States has a fundamental conflict of interest with much of the world. Now, Pat talked about how the United Nations provides a forum to understand what other countries want. President Trump here was very clear about U.S. policies under his administration. Now, he wants other countries to contain the outward flow of migration. He is telling the world that the United States is closing its borders, and he is telling the United Nations to stop financial support for refugees. And he is pressuring transit countries, those countries where refugees might not have started from, but they travel through to get to their final destination. He's pressuring those countries to halt the flow of refugees through their territory. Now that's the one critique, a very clear one, and one that he's been pretty consistent of since the beginning of this term and earlier. He then moves on to his other second big critique, and that is he argues that the scientific consensus about global warming or climate change is wrong. And he chides world leaders for pursuing green energy sources while moving away from fossil fuel consumption. And so and he sees those as almost, I don't want to say connected, but complementary in terms of the negative impacts that they have on these countries. And so this idea that when you follow both of those policies, you're going to kind of drive your country into ruin. That's his message. And he wants the rest of the world to follow the United States, I would argue, away from both of those assumptions. Now, we're going to talk about what the world thinks about that later. Now, next, we see a change here that in this summary that we just saw in U.S. policy on Russia. Now, President Trump appears to be moving away, if only slightly, from his prior claim that Ukraine will have to make territorial concessions to Russia to get peace. He is doing that by opening the door to the possibility that Ukraine can retake all the territory that is currently occupied by Russian military forces. And third, note that what the piece says about the recent changes in Russian military signals or posturing relative to NATO allies in Europe, specifically Estonia and Poland. Russia conducted military exercises directed against both those countries in the last couple of weeks. The British Prime Minister issued a Polish Prime Minister issued a very public deterrent message to Russia about its drone flights in Poland. Poland would respond with military self-defense measures. However, that statement also included an implicit question about what NATO would do if Poland responded with military force to protect its territorial integrity. And that statement is essentially asking for a reaffirmation of U.S. support for NATO. And note how this clip finishes, right? President Trump reaffirmed that support by saying that NATO members should shoot down or intercept Russian military flights over their territory. Again, note what is happening here. The leaders of Poland, and the United States are publicly discussing their military commitments to each other and reaffirming them. Okay, so let's move on to the second part of the PBS summary of President Trump at the UN last week. Go ahead and run that clip.
Blasted and blamed the UN for migration.
The UN is supposed to stop invasions, not create them and not finance them.
But with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, President Trump tweaked his tone.
Our country is behind the United Nations 100%. I think the potential of the United Nations is incredible, really incredible.
But the UN champions global cooperation and human rights, and tonight the White House called the president's speech, quote, a powerful rebuke to the destructive globalism that has fueled endless conflict and chaos around the world. Jeff?
And Nick, take us back to the president's statement on Truth Social about Ukraine. How different is that from what he said, and why is that so significant?
It is very significant. In fact, President Zelensky was just speaking to reporters, including our producer, Sonia Kopolev, and Zelensky said, quote, this is a, quote, big shift. And I want to take you back to that message that the president posted, because he talked about that Ukraine could win back all of its original forms. So let's look at the map. In 2014, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, which still is U.S. policy as part of Ukraine. After that annexation, they then invaded eastern Ukraine. And of course, in 2022, the full-scale invasion has pushed farther into eastern Ukraine and southeast Ukraine. So look at that map. You've got not only Crimea, but all the way up to parts of Kharkiv in the northeast of Ukraine, some 18 to 19% of the country. Up until today, President Trump has been very dismissive of the idea that Ukraine could somehow re-seize all that territory, or frankly even get back any of that occupied territory, let alone its original form, which would include Crimea. And senior officials have repeatedly said that there is no military solution that Ukraine can even dream of to try and get back that territory. So the fact that he is saying that after a meeting with Zelensky, after meeting Europeans today, that Ukraine could achieve that back on the battlefield is really a fundamental shift. We don't know the specifics, but it's a fundamental shift. At the same time, Jeff, the message ends this way. I wish both countries well. We'll continue to supply NATO weapons to NATO for what they want to do with them. Quote, good luck to all. President Trump at the same time is suggesting he's a little bit washing his hands of this conflict. We'll see how the policy evolves. Jeff, you saw President Trump there still promising to send American weapons to NATO, via NATO to Ukraine. But the bottom line, a fundamental shift for how President Trump at least sees the future of Ukraine itself and what it can achieve on the battlefield, Jeff.
Okay, let's highlight a couple of things of this. First, on the critique of migration, what's that about? President Trump is criticizing humanitarian assistance distributed by the United Nations to refugees. He's arguing that this financial support and the prospect of it facilitates or incentivizes migration if the financial costs of being a refugee are being defrayed by the United Nations. On the one hand, perhaps, right? On the margin, there are some people who might just need a little financial nudge to move, yes. On the other hand, we want to recognize here that the UN is trying to reduce the externalities associated with refugee flows. Many of these people are fleeing incredibly dangerous situations in their home countries, and they're leaving with nothing. So that means when they move to another country, they have nothing, and they then impose or then require support from their host country. So the UN has designed these programs to try and reduce some of the costs associated with providing humanitarian assistance that are paid by host countries, right? Again, the UN doesn't have the capacity to halt war and political persecution in these countries, but it can try to alleviate humanitarian suffering, and that is generally the principal goal of these financial aid flows. Additionally, the aid is designed, again, as I already mentioned, to reduce the burdens on host countries, to try, and by reducing the financial burdens on host countries for taking refugees, then the UN is trying to reduce the diffusion or spillover of public health or infrastructure, humanitarian catastrophes from one country to another, right? So you reduce the externalities associated with war in one country so that it doesn't spill over to its neighboring countries by defraying some of the financial costs associated with providing humanitarian assistance to the people that are fleeing. Second, note the deeper critique of the United Nations here as an organizational agent of globalism. And we get this from the White House statement that's released after his speech. This reflects a deep skepticism about the policy or orientation associated with relying on multilateral international organizations to address global problems associated with immigration, trade, or energy. Instead, and we talked about this in the units on grand strategy, the president prefers to address these policy challenges through bilateral negotiations to reduce the likelihood that other governments can leverage international rules or international forums like the United Nations to compromise U.S. sovereignty. Third, they note, and probably Rob and I were talking about this during the break here a little bit, this piece notes the shift in Ukraine, wants to call it a foundational or fundamental shift. I think we're a little bit skeptical of the nature of the conclusions drawn in that piece. But the larger line is the president opens the door to Ukraine taking back more territory. PBS wants to make a big deal of it. The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, wants to make a big deal of it. But is it really a big shift? There's some reason to be skeptical here. Track around multiple sources. For example, NBC was reporting right after the speech in the post on Truth Social that this was really just a tactical maneuver that was designed by opening that door to Ukraine taking more territory back, that this was a tactical maneuver designed to pressure Russia to simply get back to the negotiating table. Again, it's still significant here that the U.S. is giving military aid, and we're going to see this in a second when we run an interview with the Polish foreign minister. That again, the critical aid is the critical point here still is the U.S. going to continue giving military aid.
That's right. Action, not words.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Next, we want to discuss the climate summit at the United Nations that occurred within the General Assembly meetings this week. And we are going to watch a brief overview video and summarize the Paris Climate Accord shortly. But before that, we want to highlight at least two important things from the climate summit. The first is President Trump's very public and staunch opposition to the efforts of the climate summit. And the second is the response of most of the world to U.S. policies on this issue. They are just going they, meaning the rest of the world, are just going to move forward without the United States and continue to pursue policies that are designed to accelerate the green energy transition as a mechanism to limit climate change and global warming by reducing carbon dioxide emissions. In other words, the global meetings last week at the United Nations exposed the isolation of the United States on this particular issue. Now, we want to begin this discussion by providing a quick background on the Paris Climate Accord. Now, the Paris Climate Accord was adopted in December 2015 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. Yeah. That's a lot of letters, baby. So, okay, the United Nations withdrew from this agreement after President Trump was inaugurated in January of 2017. So, President Obama embraced the efforts of that convention and had the United States not only join the convention, but kind of play a leadership role in forming the sort of parameters and the goals of it, right? And so the U.S. was on board under the Obama administration, pulled out of it during the Trump administration, got back into it under the Biden administration, and then got out of it again.
In January of this year.
Yes, so a little bit of ping pong there. The agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, aims to limit global warming to well below 2% Celsius. 2 degrees. 2%, I said?
Yeah. That's okay.
2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with efforts to cap it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, to achieve this, countries commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions through what are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Individual climate action plans that are updated every 5 years or so to reflect increased ambition. So each country gets to make a commitment. This is how much we're going to reduce. This is how we're going to do it, right?
And can I say, again, what's important here, these are nationally determined contributions, right? Which implies that they're consistent with sovereignty and autonomy, right? States get to make these decisions on their own. Right,
and so that's a sort of, you can see it as a plus and a minus, right? As a plus because it, acknowledges sovereignty. It also gets everybody on board because, all you really have to do is what you're willing to do, right? No one's kind of forcing more action than you might be willing or able politically to achieve. On the downside is that if you add up all of these, goals, they don't quite reach the overall goal in the aggregate, and that's the big trade-off, right? So the Accord's principal function is an informational one. It requires countries to report regularly on their emissions and progress toward meeting their self-determined goals. This is, you shouldn't skim over this self-determined goal thing because one of the other problems with this is nobody ever reaches their self-determined goals. And so they set their own goals. They get to, and usually those goals are not that ambitious, right? By at least according to the scientific community. And then they don't even reach those, right? And so anyway, maybe I'm getting a little too off topic here, but okay. So now it also recognizes the need for financial support. And pressures, and it pressured developed countries with more, economic capacity to mobilize $100 billion annually to assist developing countries, those with fewer economic resources, in mitigation and adaptation efforts, meaning that they're going to give them some money to help them control their emissions, right? Now, importantly, the Paris Agreement is a non-binding agreement. States cannot be punished for their failure to meet their emission targets. Instead, it relies on peer pressure, public scrutiny, and global cooperation to encourage compliance, with the hope that the reporting aspects of its rules will be leveraged by citizen groups within each of the member states to get their governments to do better, right? Okay, now given this background, let's turn to the brief summary of last week's climate summit at the United Nations. Despite U.S. opposition, we will see here how the Paris Agreement is working, as China publicly declared new, more restrictive self-limits on its own carbon emissions. So let's run that clip now.
Led several countries in announcing new climate plans on Wednesday at a summit on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Chinese President Xi Jinping said in a live video message from Beijing that by 2035 his country would cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 7 to 10% from its peak. While less than many observers had hoped, China's reduction target marked the first time the world's biggest emitter pledged a cut in emissions rather than just limiting their growth. Xi also appeared to call out the United States, the world's biggest historical greenhouse gas emitter and second biggest current emitter behind China. Xi said that while some countries had moved away from the global clean energy transition and the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change, the international community should remain on track. The 10-year-old agreement aims to prevent global temperatures from rising beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius through national climate plans.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
Xi's comments came a day after U.S. President Donald Trump used his UN General Assembly speech to reject climate change. Trump went on to call scientists stupid and to criticize EU members and China for embracing clean energy technologies. Shortly after returning to office earlier this year, he ordered a second withdrawal by Washington from the Paris Treaty. And on Wednesday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who hosted the climate summit, called on all countries that are party to the Paris Agreement to set new, more ambitious plans for the next decade.
Now, we need new plans for 2035 that go much further and much faster.
Despite pressure for significant new climate commitments ahead of this year's COP30 summit in Brazil, Wednesday's announcements failed to impress environmentalists. Green groups and observers said pledges by some of the world's biggest economies fell well short of where they should be in emissions reductions. Many had been hoping that China would seize on the U.S. retreat as a moment to announce a reduction target of at least 30% to stay in line with its past goal of net zero emissions by 2060.
So let me highlight a few things from this clip. First, China announced planned cuts of greenhouse gases of 7 to 10% from its peak levels by 2035. This announcement disappointed some, but reflects a change in their policy whereby they're now pursuing emission cuts rather than they're just trying to slowly increase in their emissions. Second, we see real U.S. and China conflict on this issue. There are multiple aspects of this conflict. One is over the strength of the scientific consensus, and the second, larger one, the scientific consensus, or the conflict over the science is probably embedded in the larger one, which is over the distributional consequences of engineering the energy transition. President Trump is arguing that this energy transition is too costly. It will undermine the long-run economic growth of the United States and other countries because fossil fuels are still cheap. And Trump is simultaneously saying, right, if the world moves away from fossil fuels, then it could hurt the American economies as well, right? And his concern here about about these costs, these distributional costs, rest on a political calculation too about the likelihood of failed cooperation among states on this issue, right? He said repeatedly that it's risky for the U.S. to risk this massive energy transition where we're changing the public infrastructure of the United States if other countries won't do the same, right? He's skeptical that other countries like China will honor these obligations. And if China isn't going to make the changes, then why should the United States? And so he uses this preemptively to make a case for we just got to handle things on our own because we can't make international agreements because we can't trust other states to abide by their commitments. So third, we would ask that you think about this disagreement that's nested within a discussion about the economic incentives associated with renewable energy. I think what's striking to me from the climate summit last week is that the rest of the world is still making a bet that the energy transition will help to pay for itself. as public investments reduce the costs of developing renewable energy. So the rest of the world, by holding the climate summit and continuing to engineer these economic policy changes, is saying that it disagrees with President Trump. Right? And they're saying, and the other thing that's important here is, governments are saying that the economic rewards associated with increasing the production of renewable energy will grow as consumer preferences shift around the world as well. As people buy more electric cars, or as businesses and individuals put more solar panels on their homes and offices because they care about climate change, because they believe in the science of climate change. And so the question we want you to think about here is, what happens if the Trump administration is wrong about the benefits of about the economic benefits of renewable energy? And we're going to talk about this at the end of the semester. We've got to, we're going to read something from former Republican leaders talking about the economic benefits, Republican political leaders such as Secretary of State George Shultz, who write a piece saying there are huge economic benefits associated with investments in renewable energy. And they're arguing that the U.S. will fall behind if it doesn't embrace these alternative energies, right? And so then the larger question here is, what happens if the demand for these renewable energy sources grow, but production is then concentrated in China? Right? Xi Jinping indicated that China is moving forward on the green energy transition. We would ask whether he would do that if China's leaders expected these policies would undermine long-run economic growth in China. And so it's important. We can talk about the science of global warming, but you should also think about the long-run economic consequences, right? Trump is saying there's going to be high costs for pursuing an energy transition. What happens if there's a high economic cost for not pursuing that energy transition?
Being the only major country not to engage in it.
And important here, it's important to note, the choice of pictures in that video were intentional at the end, which is that Chinese leaders are responding to the preferences of their public on this issue. You saw the pictures indicating poor air quality in Beijing. The leaders are responding to demands to offset the growing health risks associated with climate change and CO2 emissions there as well.
Yeah, and if you think about the economics of this, one of the things that's also happening already is and a lot of different voices are warning about this, is that the production of all these technologies, solar panels, for example, they always seem to point to solar panels, and the production of those is getting more and more concentrated in China, and that this is going to be a problem for the United States if it doesn't shift its policies a bit to try to be a part of what might be a huge economic change. And so that's something to watch. All right, so in the last section of the class today, we want to revisit questions about European security, the Ukraine war, and the durability of NATO that shaped many of the diplomatic meetings and statements trickling out from the United Nations General Assembly meetings last week. And so we've talked about the Ukraine war before, but one of the things to note here is that an event like the General Assembly kind of brings an additional or renewed focus on these kinds of conflicts. And so we have already noted President Trump publicly adjusted his negotiating posture on the war by reopening the door to the possibility that Ukraine could reclaim all of the territory that Russian military forces have occupied since the war escalated in February of 2022. So more than 3 years ago, right? President Zelensky described this statement as a big and important shift in U.S. policy, as it suggested that the U.S. might not pressure Ukraine to give up significant territorial concessions as a price for peace. Moreover, we should also note that Russia's military posture to NATO members in Europe has changed over the past few weeks, and this is a big development as well. You already saw that Russia has flown military maneuvers with planes and drones targeting Estonia and Poland. These are both members of NATO. Now, Polish leaders have responded publicly with warnings that they will take military action of self-defense if these incursions happen again. And President Trump has reaffirmed Poland's right to do this. So we want to discuss these changes briefly and explore the implication for the war in Ukraine and alliance cooperation within NATO. And to do so, we want to watch a video from Fareed Zakaria's GPS show that aired on Sunday, September 28th. It's an interview with the Polish Foreign Minister, Radosław Sikorski. And so let's run that clip now.
Earlier this month, Russia sent some 20 drones into Poland's airspace. Then it sent a drone into Romania. And for 12 minutes on September 19th, 3 Russian fighter jets lingered over the skies in Estonia before NATO mobilized F-35 jet fighters to repel them. At an emergency UN Security Council meeting this week, Poland's Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Radek Sikorski delivered a sharp rebuke to Russia. I talked to Sikorski on Thursday at Poland's consulate here in New York. Radek Sikorski, welcome on the show. You gave quite a remarkable speech at the UN, and at the end of it, you issued a threat to Russia, I think a veiled threat, but a threat, which was in effect that were there to be other incursions, another incursion of Russian drones into Polish airspace, you might do more than shoot them down. There was an implication that NATO might take this battle to Russia.
No, that wasn't the implication. But yes, we see Russian actions as a part of the spectrum of their hybrid war, which includes information warfare, arsons, assassinations, sending parcels with incendiary devices, pushing migrants across the Belarusian-Polish border, and now these drones deliberately sent into Poland. And of course, we have the right to defend our airspace, the security of our citizens and their property. And there are procedures for it. You intercept incoming drones or aircraft. You try to send them home, or you try to make them land.
But you said you have been warned. That was your last line.
Yes.
What were you warning them about?
In the end, every sovereign country has the right to deal with intruders. You wouldn't tolerate Cuban MiGs over Florida, and we will, in the end, protect our citizens.
Do you believe that this is part of a Russian strategy of probing to see whether NATO is actually going to respond if it were to do things in NATO territory?
Yes, we do. This was a deliberate provocation. 21 drones were launched from a single location, different from the launch sites of the drones against Ukraine, and the composition of the drone swarm was different. If it was a sideshow of the attack on Ukraine, you would expect the same proportion of armed and unarmed drones. All these drones were unarmed. Instead of warheads, they had extra fuel tanks. So the Russians were trying to test us without starting the war. Test our air defenses, test the resilience of our population, the unity of our government, and our allies. And I'm glad to say that our Dutch, Italian, German allies were there with us in the fight.
Here. First, Zakaria intentionally tries to clarify the nature of the threat that Poland was making relative to Russia. He asked, will you do more than shoot down Russian drones? Will you launch military action in Russian territory? And Sikorski clearly, after he checks himself and opens his eyes, says no. We will follow procedures, we will intercept drones, and we will protect our citizens. So, we wanted to show you this because it's interesting in the sense that there is intentional clarification about what Poland will do if Russia does this again. And so it's very carefully trying to provide information about the nature of the strategic conflict and interaction. Right. Second, Zakaria asks, what do you think Russia is doing? And he's asking, how is Russia signaling? And he's asking him, how are you interpreting the signals? And what does Sikorski say? Everything's a test. They are checking to see how we will respond. The drones were unarmed. They wanted to see our responses. They wanted to see our air defenses. They wanted to see how the government would respond. Would political support for the government be maintained? And they were checking the unity of allies? In other words, will NATO hold, and will other NATO members respond in a way that's supportive of Poland? And so what we see here, and what Zakaria is pressing around, is we see this elaborate signaling game that's going on between the Russian government and the Polish government. And both sides are trying to reveal private information about their intentions and how they are interpreting the actions of the other one. And so you are in the midst now of your other course content of reading about the bargaining model of war. One of the principal causes of war is problems of private information. Well, how do you eliminate problems of private information? You get it through military actions and public statements that's designed to say, this is what our interests are, this is how we interpret our actions, these are our costs for going to war. This is what this diplomatic interchange that was going on between Poland and Russia and the United States. This is, think about this all as they are bargaining. Right. They are bargaining to try and prevent a broader war, but at the same time, they are negotiating. And Russia is testing Poland and NATO to see how far it will go to push back Russian incursions in Eastern Europe. Right. Okay. So let's watch the second part of this interview now.
By the way, lasted 7 hours. And allies have also sent us additional anti-drone and anti-aircraft assets since then.
What do you make of President Trump's seeming reversal of policy on Ukraine? He now says Ukraine can win the war, it can recover its territories. Previously, he and Secretary Hetzek had said there's no way they're going to get these territories back. The Russians will keep them, and that's okay.
I think President Trump is seeing what we are seeing, namely that the Russian offensive has petered out. Russia's size is playing against it because it is impossible for Russia to protect all its assets with anti-aircraft capabilities. So Ukraine has already attacked something like half of Russian refineries, which means that it's more difficult for the war machine to continue to attack Ukraine. And President Trump famously likes backing a winner.
But on the crucial issue of, is he willing to put pressure on Russia, give more arms to Ukraine, put in place more sanctions against Russia? So far, there's nothing. Do you expect that to change?
We hope that the US does that, because Putin will only stop this war when he thinks he can't win. And for him to come to that conclusion, there needs to be more pressure on the Russian economy and more help for the Ukrainians. But the American side, I think, is planning to buy some Ukrainian drones. I think it's testimony to Ukraine's achievement during this war. This war will likely end the way World War I ended. One side or the other will run out of resources to carry on.
So you are looking at this war and you think that Ukraine can hold out, that Russia is weaker than perhaps many of us have thought. And so the tide is turning in Ukraine's favor?
Putin started this war on hyper-optimistic assumptions. He thought that he was going to have a coup in Kiev, that it would take 3 days, that Ukrainians will welcome him with open arms because they are just misguided Russians. All of those assumptions proved to be incorrect, and he's mired in a war which is destroying Russia's future, which has already cost 1 million dead and wounded. And the trouble is that he can't admit the mistake to himself or to the Russian people. These colonial wars usually take about a decade. They only end when the aggressor concludes that he can't win. And usually they are ended by a different team than started it.
Wow, well, that means you're talking about many more years, possibly. I mean, depending on whether you started in 2014 or 2022, and you're talking about possible regime change in Russia.
Well, if you look at Russia's history, Russia lost plenty of wars. The Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, got knocked out of World War I, lost the invasion of Poland 1920, lost the invasion of Afghanistan, and lost the Cold War. And they all have one thing in common. only after the war have there been reforms in Russia. And in fact, reforms only happen after a lost war. So actually, to lose this war for Russia, it would not only be good for Ukraine and for Europe, but also for Russia.
And in almost all those cases, there was regime change in Russia.
After Russo-Japanese War, which was brought to an end actually by the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, with the Treaty of Portsmouth, Nicholas II bought himself 12 years.
Radek Sikorski, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, well, a few things to talk about here. So let me raise a couple things. First, Sikorski, he comments on Russian military vulnerabilities, and he argues that Ukraine can continue to impose costs on Russia if it continues to fight. I think that he has a point, kind of. And so there was this military offensive. There's always an offensive in this sort of spring, summer by each side, and each side has tried to get some territorial advantage and conquest during those vital months when the weather isn't going to play a huge role. It was Russia's offensive this time in 2025. It started to make some gains. There was a lot of news coverage about the gains it was making, and it was getting close to, especially in the north, Kharkiv and in those territories. It petered out. And everyone pretty much agrees now that that Russian offensive that looked like it was really potentially going to make significant territorial change and changes on the military balance of things really didn't achieve its goals. Now, this happened to Ukraine a year ago, 2 years ago, when it had the momentum. It tried an offensive and it kind of slowed down. And so Russia's slowed down. I think that that's then some cause for optimism that Ukraine can continue to fight. The idea that Ukraine can now regain all of the territory that Russia and its military occupy right now, I think is quite a far reach, to be honest. I think it's aspirational. I think that, but there's nothing I've seen, and I think a lot of experts would agree that, in terms of pure military capabilities, Ukraine doesn't really have the resources or the personnel to actually achieve that, right? I mean, there for the longest time when this last offensive by Russia was seemingly succeeding, it was because Russia had more soldiers and was losing tons of soldiers in this, but it just had more soldiers. And Ukraine had, and has had for quite a while now, a severe limitation on the number of, conscription age males in particular at its disposal to fight this war.
So I agree with your skepticism, but if we continue with his World War I and 1917 analogy, is if there's new information released about domestic political vulnerabilities in Russia and regime change, not on the table now, but you can imagine under those circumstances, right, if there's significant regime change in Russia, that Ukraine then recaptures much of its territory, not in military terms, but in part of political concessions, because the interests of the Russian government change at that point.
Yeah, perhaps.
But there's not a lot of evidence right there. No, it's just more because he invoked the 1917.
There's, Russia does have some serious economic problems on the horizon here, and it has been kind of, its economy has been surprisingly resilient during this whole thing. And so it has sort of reshaped its whole economy into a wartime economy. It still has been able to sell its oil. And so that machine is probably going to still go. It's just not, Russia's not going to get any more territory either. So it's not, neither side is, it's still, to my mind, a stalemate. That's what I would say the fight is a stalemate, which is a huge win for Ukraine right now, right? Because it's so much smaller and it was running out of soldiers. And if the United States actually sells it follows up all this talk with some action to give more weapons to Ukraine, then perhaps that would make a difference.
Can I take this one?
Yes, please do.
So the one thing that I thought was really interesting, and one of the reasons, again, why we assigned this, is notice what he says about how the war will end, right? Putin will continue to fight as long as he thinks he can win. And so he's implying that you need to alter those beliefs to get Putin to the negotiating table, either through raising the costs in this war of attrition, imposing more economic costs on the Russian economy, or he hints at the idea that Ukraine has demonstrated greater geographic reach of strikes, imposing strikes or attacking Russian resources deeper into Russian territory.
The oil refinery attacks, those sorts of things, yeah.
But again, this is, if we think, I'm convinced after watching this again, I was like, the foreign minister has read about the bargaining model of war. Because he's talking about beliefs, he's talking about signals, and he's talking about expectations of victory. All of this stuff is embedded in the bargaining model of war.
Well, if you think about even the most interpretations and even certain public statements by Putin, especially when he's talking to his domestic audience, the war of attrition is not only between Russia and Ukraine. It's between Russia and the West, right? And so the biggest impact that statement from President Trump had about Ukraine being able to take back all the land, and that the United States is still going to sell weapons to NATO for those purposes. And when Poland is threatened by Russian, aircraft and drones, when asked, should NATO shoot those down, he says yes. Is all information that says we are not going to stop supporting Ukraine, right? And so if Russia believes. So Russia has always counted on, especially once President Trump was elected, that the United States would simply withdraw its support. If the United States withdraws its support, Russia's going to win this war of attrition. Russia is going to outlast Ukraine. But if especially if the United States, but if the United States and Europe stays diligent in support of Ukraine, then I would say, he's probably right. The West, Russia with support from the West can outlast Russia. Ukraine can outlast Russia if it gets enough support. That would be something that could then bring an end to the war, much like he points out that there's going to be the war ends when one side runs out of resources. Russia's going to run out of resources eventually if it's not just fighting Ukraine.
So I think we have the makings of a prediction here from Professor Moser, which is, we couple the West staying in, and what we've got is new signals from the Trump administration. If you compare to, say, February and March of this year, new signals, we're going to give them the resources and let them fight it out. You open the door and say Ukraine can get some of its territory. And so if Putin was expecting the Trump electoral victory was going to lead to new pressure on Ukraine to get out. That's not happening over the last couple of months. And then if we combine that, the shift in orientation from the U.S. with another significant failed military offensive, then we get closer to what Sikorsky is talking about. Does Putin stop believing that he can win the war? And that's what you need to get peace, at least according to the Polish Prime Minister.
Yes. And I'd say that it would help if some additional action, besides just words, came from especially the United States. More weapons or something that would demonstrate credibility. That we're in it. We're not going to quit. And there's too many dual messages here. Even in that post, right at the end is like, I wish all countries well. Like I'm out. Kind of like yeah, Ukraine will win, can win and can retake all the, if Europe keeps helping it, right?
Yeah.
But if he slams the door on that option, that potential outcome that the United States just retreats, then I think, I think we get closer.
All right.
And then after that, who knows? You know, the last part, I know we should stop here, but is that after a failed war, what happens in Russia? Regime change.
Yeah.
And we'll see about that too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right, we weren't going to talk about the Ukraine war. After the first segment, the plan was we wouldn't, but we did clearly. It was part of the big news from last week. Maybe it'll show up again in one of our last three segments. If you have questions, as always, please reach out to us. Otherwise, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
All right.